U.S. defense official flags no objections to Kiev attacking Crimea. Washington will not limit Ukrainian strikes on territory it claims as its own, Celeste Wallander said. The U.S. would have no objections to Ukrainian forces striking targets inside Crimea with American-supplied weapons, a senior defense official said on Friday. Dr. Celeste Wallander, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, was asked whether Washington supports Kiev in seizing Crimea, or at least in striking Russian targets there. The peninsula overwhelmingly voted to become part of Russia in 2014 following a Western-backed coup in Kiev. Speaking at the Center for a New American Security, Wallander reiterated that the U.S. supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty over its internationally recognized borders, and that includes Crimea. With this in mind, the official argued that Kiev has the right to defend every inch of its territory. As long as Ukraine identifies operational value in targeting Russian forces on Ukrainian territory, we don't have objections and do not seek to limit Ukrainian military operations to achieve their objectives. Russia didn't start the fight but will finish it, said Putin. She also commented on remarks made by Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley, who warned in January that it would be very difficult for Ukraine to militarily eject the Russian forces from all the territories they currently control. I am not going to contradict General Milley, and I think he was giving a hard-headed assessment of the scale of the challenge, she said. In January, the New York Times reported, citing sources, that the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden was warming to the prospect of helping Ukraine to target Crimea, even if such a move increases the risk of escalation. On February 3, the U.S. announced a new $2.17 billion security package for Ukraine which included ground-launched, small-diameter bombs, GLSDB, with a range of up to 150 kilometers, 93 miles. While the Pentagon said that this long-range capability would enable Ukrainians to take back their sovereign territory, it declined to speculate about Kiev's future potential operations. Last week, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who now serves as deputy chair of the nation's Security Council, warned that any attack on Crimea would be interpreted as an attack on the country itself. Kiev, he said, must understand that such moves would be met with inevitable retaliation using weapons of any kind. Russian military shares details of massive strikes on Ukraine. All intended targets were hit, Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov says. Large-scale Russian missile strikes on Friday brought the operations of Ukraine's key defense enterprises to a halt and prevented Kiev from redeploying reserves and foreign hardware to the battlefield, Russia's defense ministry has said. The attack involved high-precision, long-range air, sea, and land-based weapons as well as drones, the ministry's spokesman, Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov, told reporters during his daily briefing on Saturday. It targeted critically important energy facilities, providing power to Ukraine's defense enterprises and the country's transport system, he said. The goals of the massive strike were achieved. All of the intended facilities were hit, Konashenkov said. As a result of the bombardment, the operations of energy-intensive enterprises of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex were stopped. The redeployment of foreign weapons, ammunition, and reserves by rail to the areas on the front lines was also blocked, the spokesman noted. Air raid warnings had been activated all across Ukraine since early Friday. Reports of explosions came from the capital Kiev, along with the regions of Kharkov, Odessa, Dnipro, Nikolov, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and other locations. Ukraine's Air Force said that at least 71 cruise missiles were fired by Russian long-range bombers and Navy vessels from the Black Sea. Most of those missiles were shot down by air defenses, it claimed. Ukraine's energy operator, Ukrenergo, has confirmed that several of its high-voltage sites nationwide were hit. The company said it had to implement emergency shutdowns to preempt possible damage to the power grid from overload. The country's railway operator, Ukrzaliznytsia, also said the power cuts had delayed a number of trains and led to some electric locomotives being replaced with backup diesel engines. Moscow has stepped up the pressure on Ukraine since October last year, when it accused Kiev of using terrorist tactics and of targeting Russian infrastructure, including the strategic Crimean bridge. Since then, a number of large-scale missile strikes have been carried out against Ukrainian military installations and energy facilities, leading to rolling blackouts across the country. Russia explains stance on peace talks with Ukraine. Any conflict ends with negotiations, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin has said. Russia remains ready for peace talks with Ukraine, but these should take place with no preconditions and ought to account for realities on the ground, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin has said. There have already been negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian representatives in Minsk and Istanbul, several weeks after the outbreak of the conflict in February last year, Vershinin told broadcaster Zvezda on Saturday. As you remember, they were interrupted by the Ukrainian side. Decisions on such issues as a peace process aren't made in Kiev. The decisions are made in other capitals, first of all in Washington and Brussels. And that's whom one should address about talks, the senior diplomat pointed out. As for Russia's stance, he reiterated that any military action concludes with negotiations and, as we've said earlier, will obviously be ready for such negotiations. However, Vershinin stressed that talks should take place without preconditions, based on the reality that exists and taking into account the goals that had been voiced publicly by Moscow. On Friday, U.S. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby insisted that it was really up to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to determine if and when negotiations are appropriate, and certainly under what circumstances. Washington will stay at the task of supporting Ukraine so that they can succeed at the battlefield against Russia, as that will allow Zelensky to have the wind at his back when such talks begin, Kirby pointed out. Last week, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who'd mediated contacts between Moscow and Kiev, claimed that the negotiations that took place between the sides in Istanbul in late March were blocked by Kiev's Western backers. I think there was a legitimate decision by the West to keep striking Russian President Vladimir Putin. I mean the more aggressive approach, he said. Russia and Ukraine haven't met at the negotiating table since then, with Zelensky signing a decree in autumn officially banning him from any dialogue with Putin. The Ukrainian leader is currently pushing forward with his 10-point peace plan, which, among other things, calls for Russian forces to withdraw to borders claimed by Ukraine, to pay reparations and to submit to war crime tribunals. Moscow has turned down those demands as unacceptable, saying that they were actually a sign of Kiev's unwillingness to solve the crisis through diplomatic means.